inviting me to do this, and thank you for all the organisational work you've done in getting this wonderful occasion going once again. I enjoy them so much, always look forward to it. Now, we keep this brief. We won't go around the panel and ask them to identify themselves because you already know who they are, and we have lost a little bit of time in the changeover of rooms. So let's just take questions and comments. Brisk, I think, brisk questions and comments to be addressed to any member of the panel or all. Please, if you would.
Thanks. I really enjoyed, Stephen, your presentation, particularly because of the reference to poetry, and I would love to hear you and other panel members talk about what you think the importance of poetry is in education, in a more general sense, but maybe particularly in early childhood, in primary school, and anything that Chesterton has to say about its merits as well.
Yeah, thank you. The importance of it in childhood, I mean... It's not working. It's not working.
Just
speaking.
Is it working?
Yeah, there you go.
Talk into it. There you go.
Nice and close.
It is working, is it?
Yes.
Yeah, just now, yeah, it's good. Yeah.
At the start of that series of lectures, I suppose, for want of a better term.
Just get real close.
You have to talk into it.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
At the start of that sequence of lectures on good reading for children, Senior and Quinn talk about Mother Goose. In other words, nursery rhymes, Little Bo Peep and so on. And they say it's essential, these things are essential, and every culture has their version of those. You progress from nursery rhymes to folk tales, essentially. And you know, all of these things, which were once part of an oral tradition, were, you know, in recent centuries really, 17th, 18th, 19th century, gathered together and put into book form. So people like the Grimm brothers collected the folk fairy tales. So they're absolutely essential that we tell stories. So it's essential that we tell the best stories. And there is I think he was exposed at some point as a plagiarist, but nonetheless, there's a good book by a psychologist called Bruno Bettelheim called The Uses of Enchantment. He talks about the importance of the folk fairy tale in a child's development. One thing that it does is that it introduces, you know, people at an impressionable age to material that is in some ways in another order not possible to deal with. In other words, danger and threats and Little Red Riding Hood and so on. There's something menacing in the folk fairy tale Hansel and Gretel, but it also shows how the folk wisdom has found solutions to these problems. So that's what I'd say. So poetry in the larger sense is important from a very young age and right through.
I'd love to give a different perspective because I was sort of coming from one of those dreaded STEM backgrounds, but when I was homeschooling my children, especially the ones I took through high school, I saw literature as vitally important because, and I think, Dale, you'll have to give me the quote, but humanity is not quite rational. That if we take ourselves too seriously, it's the mathematicians that go mad, not the poets. And I think a rounded education is important, and not just poetry, but I would see all of literature. And I think it's one of the places where the English curriculum in school, in Australia at least, has been subverted into text types.
Yeah.
And there's no longer the depth that leads you to moral conclusions, but just almost like it's a Marxist kind of interpretation, as sort of exposing conflict and that sort of thing, which is taught in schools now. Maybe not with the big M badge, but it's definitely sort of inhuman, anti-human. Whereas getting back to what Stephen was describing, I think it's getting back to humanity. And things like Grimm's fairy tales tell you more about humanity even though they've got magic and fairies and all the rest of it, but they're telling essential things about humanity, which is hard, especially for someone who's maybe got a bit of a bent towards mathematics and science.
I think it surprises a lot of people when they hear that one of the poets who was most influential on G.K. Chesterton was Walt Whitman. A lot of people don't know that. That's just a big shocker. And what was your euphemism that you used, Steve?
Scoundrel.
Scoundrel. Yeah. So
Hopkins.
yeah. So Chesterton, he talked about the fact that Walt Whitman kind of saved his life when he was in a period of great depression, his late adolescent depression, self-destructive, and Walt Whitman gave him this joy of life that he hadn't ever encountered before, and he was just thrilled to have discovered that poetry. And he said when he found out later that there were stories attributed about him, the scoundrel issue, he said, well, if he was that way, he wasn't for me. And that had no effect on him when he was reading Walt Whitman. The great irony is that Chesterton would go on to absolutely loathe free verse. He, as a defender of traditional things, he was a defender of rhyme and meter. And he saw that the way that free verse had just absolutely taken over poetry in the 20th century was a real loss for poetry. That poetry's greatness was the fact that you could use the rhyme and the meter as a way of remembering the poems, whether you're a child or an adult. That the impact of the language is so much stronger with the use of the poetic forms. He said, if we were only real enough, we would all talk in rhyme.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen, for that. Now, have we got another question? Right, I'll bring it down to you, actually. Paddy?
This isn't really a question, it's a statement. The new head of the ABC, Kim Williams, was decrying about 2 to 3 weeks ago in one of the major newspapers about the lack of poetry that's happened in Australia, that's gone about, and it's just not being taught, it's not being said, it's not being used. And it saddened me greatly when I heard that. As a person, a child of the 50s and the 60s, I grew up on poetry. In our home, we had Spencer Patterson, Henry Lawson, all of the great Australian poets. They were compulsory in our house. I was very fortunate, I was one of 6 children being brought up in a country town. But it wasn't unusual for people to know Australian poetry and their poets. It is a great tragedy that's happened. And just on education generally, the thing is, I think we sometimes get very, very carried away and rely on schools to do the educating. But we all know that education starts in the home, and that actual schools are a recent human invention. Up until the end of the 19th century, they just did not exist. And all education occurred in the home. And it just saddens me that we have parents who, of no particular religion or anything like that, they think they can just send their kids off to school and have nothing to do with the education of their own children. And for those people here who are grandparents, you should be getting your grandchildren and teaching them poetry. It helps them enormously with mathematics, with life, with everything, and helpful in our culture. And it's very, very sad that poetry is not liked and it is not used as much as what it has been done in previous generations.
Be replaced by drag queen story hours.
And anyone from the committee like, oh, actually, Paul, put yours too, and then we'll see if the committee want to respond. There we go. Right.
Thank you, David. your talk on those issues, the economic issues and whatnot. I too become aware of those 15, 20 years ago when I started reading Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc and Father Vincent McNabb and these people. So I don't know whether there's the same interest. Earlier in the day we've heard all about the things that are happening in the education line with the new liberal arts colleges and the growth of that. But what about in the economic, on the issues you spoke on, is there anything happening as to develop a new system along those lines? Is it practical? Can it happen? I've read pictures of it over the years, you know, but it's never gone any further.
I think our problem is that we're trying to do sort of a Christian solution to the economic problem within a modern framework. We only want that much change that suits us with the framework we're comfortable with. Try and get somebody to be reflective of what we think of as private property rights. And then you've got an argument on your hand. And that's really the Hudge and Gudge or the socialist or capitalist kind of thing. So it's probably not going to happen by sort of just, some smart person coming along and convincing the majority, or the majority changing their mind. Now this is a dismal prediction, but if you look at sort of the end of the Roman Empire, it took really until 800 for it to recover to the point where it's starting to be civilised, with the coronation of Charlemagne. And then it took another 300 years for the medieval period to begin, which is really sort of the Middle Ages on steroids with St Anselm, right? But in the middle there you got 500 years of people just sticking around. And we forgot, well, the West forgot how to make concrete. And, okay, we make concrete buildings now. But they were making it back, in Roman times, right? They forgot it. And the reason was that that's what it took to actually kick-start civilization again. So I'm not expecting something in the next 50 years.
But we are making steps to try to turn, we're talking about turning a big ship. And Chesterton says it starts with a tendency against a tendency. To do nothing means nothing's going to happen. But if we start making little changes in our own lives, we can start to have an effect on the people around us. And that's why that's the main reason why we changed the name distributism to localism. That you can start exercising local changes, and you can start to decentralize in your own behavior. Chesterton says distributism cannot be done to people, it has to be done by people. But we have that book over there, Localism, and I would recommend if you haven't gotten that, get that one, because that's about putting Chesterton's economic ideas, his ideas of social teaching into practice, some practical ways, and some ways that people have been able to do it. And it does come back to the discussion of education, because the Chesterton Academies actually are an example of implementing Catholic social teaching, because we are starting local schools. We're getting away from the centralized schools, which are really run by Hudge and Gudge. All right.
Okay, terrific. There's one more here. We got some more coming up? Okay, Peter.
Derek and Dale, you made my question a little superfluous. Really, I was going to mention distributism, which I hadn't heard anything about today until you just mentioned it then, really. But I thought, Derek, in your discussion of Hudge and Hudge, whether that middle way, which you seem to be indicating, or the other way, that might be seriously considered would be distributism. It seemed to be a middle way to me. You didn't mention it. Does that not apply? Would you not consider distributism somewhere between socialism and capitalism as a more beneficial and a more moral and ethical approach to economics?
to really pull off distributism, I think you need to have a community which is thinking outside of that narrow left-right materialist dimension. Right? It is a middle way in a sense, but it's a middle way in the same way that if we've got, you know, an ant crawling across the edge of the step here, and I hold something up here, you say, yes, it's halfway between the other side of the stage, but it's not on the left-right dimension, right? And there are other ways that suit different cultures. Distributism is very promising for our time in history, and so I would say it is one of the solutions. But there are others. The indigenous people I was talking about, they're not distributors, but they basically achieve the objectives that we're talking about in localism. So there are other solutions. One of the problems practically in the last century, say, is that there have been fairly effective movements that have picked little parts of the problem and then they've made that the whole solution. And they've had very often strong Catholic support, and there's been a number of them, and they've picked different parts of the economy. Douglas Social Credit, the Georgists, certainly the distributist kind of initiatives through the 20th century. Their endurance has been a problem. You know, it's a great idea, but it sort of tends to fade out. Mondragon in Spain, terrific, but it's kind of gone a bit off the boil. And that's where evangelisation as the solution that, you know, at the end of the great social encyclicals, you've got to have people's hearts changed, and then everything else will fall in place. They'll naturally become distributors. They'll naturally be accepting of, you know, putting poetry back into education and so on. But you've got to have the heart in the right place as the first requirement.
I think we should also remember that distributism is only one approach to implementing Catholic social teaching. And it's probably the most overt attempt to implement Catholic social teaching as it was organized by Chesterton and Belloc in their circle. No one else was doing it to the extent that they were. They were really trying to use Pope Leo's ideas, Leo XIII's ideas, and put them into practice. But there's other ways to do it other than a distributist model. But there's going to be elements of distributism in all of them, because it's the idea of, you know, but it has to start locally. That's really why we changed the name. It has to start locally, getting a local community, changing the behavior of a group of people, changing the way they buy things, changing the way they earn their money. But we are seeing a rise in small businesses, in entrepreneurship across the U.S. I'm sure that in Australia you've seen the same thing with the rise of microbreweries, for instance. Everyone knows that locally made beer is going to be better than the urine that's made in big, large breweries in St. Louis or some other remote city. And so, and I don't even like beer, I know that. But things like that, they realize that, okay, this locally produced thing is better than the mass-produced thing. And so they are realizing it. When someone says buy local, when a store says buy local, everyone realizes, yeah, that's a good thing, we should do that. We should give our money to our neighbors rather than giving it to a chain store where the money is going to go out of the community. It's a slow process, but we can start making the changes. To answer your question, yes, it is starting to happen, and there is evidence of it.
Thank you.
I've never heard the term localism before used as an alternative to distributism.
That's why I came to Australia.
But I've got to, just a note of caution though, it may not have the same sort of traction here because it's very, very reminiscent of the one of the slogans of the Greens here, which was think locally.
And yet this
think
is
globally, act locally.
But this is actually the way to convert the Greens. It's a really interesting way. We can own the word now.
Yes.
And because we can implement the word.
Yeah.
And the thing about localism, it does appeal across the political spectrum.
Yes. It does, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, what they thought it meant was, don't burn coal here, send it to China, and burn a lot more. time to stop? Okay, we need to stop. So thank you very much, Carl and Virginia and Gay and Mark and all those who've helped, and of course the speakers have been splendid. And on behalf of you all, let me thank you.